The 2017 OSU World Cup was insane. It was home to some of the most hype and unexpected matches ever, and it was also a turning point for OSU tournaments as a whole. It's gone down as one of the most legendary events in the game's history for a reason. What led up to the insanity of the finals and what was one of the biggest upsets the game had ever seen. This is a story of OWC 2017. Let's start with a recap of OWC 2016, because it can provide some crucial context for what happened in 2017. First, the strongest teams, who go something like this. The strongest was either the US or China, with the US winning the tournament, but China putting up insanely close performances in both the semifinals and the grand finals. Next would definitely be South Korea, who only lost to China and the US, making them pretty clearly the third strongest. And then Germany and the UK both played well, but in comparison to the other three, they weren't all too strong. Going into 2017, most of these teams would say fairly similar in their lineup, but there were a few notable changes, like South Korea, who lost Mayim Sucks and Lavals, who both played very well the previous year. And then China, who had the biggest change, when they lost Russ Bell, one of the greatest players of all time, and probably the best player in the entire tournament for the last 2 years. This meant that South Korea was a bit weaker, and China was a whole lot weaker. And then on the flip side, the US and the UK both got a fair bit stronger, with the UK adding Spare, who become part of their main lineup, and having Bubbleman and Carthy improve a lot. And then there was the US, who was really a force to be reckoned with in 2017, since after winning the previous year, the addition of Apraxia, Monko 2K, and Digital Hypno, all three of whom are some of the best tournament players in the entire world, made the US somehow even get stronger than it was last year. And with South Korea losing a bit of its star power, and China becoming alright at best without Russ Bell, the tournament wasn't really looking like it was going to be too eventful. Groups only really seemed to confirm this suspicion. When in groups, China almost lost to Italy, and then lost to the Netherlands. And don't get me wrong, they were both very good teams, but they also weren't anywhere near as good as China was the previous year. The group stages did also show that South Korea and the UK were likely to be frontrunners, with both, like the US, winning all of their matches in groups. But although these were the main frontrunners, one other country stood out a bit: Poland. They were a fairly mediocre team from the previous year, who had gained a few strong players like Waxen and Mr. Boone, but it still kept their core of Rafis and Webblefulf almost identical. And although Rafis had gotten a lot better and Webblefulf had already been known for being an incredible tournament player, they were both known for being incredible the year before, and they'd still been fairly lackluster. And so, even after sweeping the group, it didn't seem like they would stand much of a chance, especially against a team as strong as the US, who literally had 3 or 4 of the best tournament players of all time. And especially since Poland's group wasn't all too strong, this didn't really seem to prove much. Groups weren't all too eventful, but the round of 16 would be when things began to get interesting, since it would contain the first big upset of the tournament, when South Korea faced Taiwan. Taiwan was a team that had been incredible. They'd even been first in the first OWC, and second in OWC 2013, only ever losing to South Korea when they were by far the best team. But over the years, Taiwan had seemed to be passed by other teams, becoming better. They were still very good, but they just weren't quite as good as South Korea in 2016, and they were beaten 6-2. But when they met in the round of 16 in 2017, the situation completely changed, because in a pretty ironic turn of events, Taiwan would beat Korea 6-2. This meant that even with an almost identical team, Taiwan had gotten much better, and they'd beaten one of the top seeds in the tournament. This set Taiwan up as a possible contender for the finals, and it also painted a very grim picture for South Korea, who really did seem to be struggling after losing Mayim Sucks and Lavals. After this, though, all the other matches went about as expected, with the US, Germany, Brazil, Hong Kong, Russia, the UK, and Poland all moving on to the next round. There really isn't much to say about the quarterfinals, since pretty much everything went the way most people thought it would. Taiwan beat Germany and continued to prove that their team was very good this year. South Korea stayed afloat in losers. Poland beat Brazil, and then the US beat Russia. But this would finally set up some very interesting matchups. Most notably, the US versus Taiwan, and Poland versus the UK. All 4 teams had made pretty easy work of everyone they'd faced up to that point, and so this is where the hierarchy of the tournament would become much more clear. Let's start with the losers matches. South Korea beat Norway very convincingly and then faced Brazil, where they actually had a huge amount of trouble.
I'm just thinking, like, is this going to be the highest PP player we'll see this tournament? If this does get submitted as Scorpio 1 and PP.
I mean, you could also do the calculations for Scorpio 2 if that's the thing. If you take slider accuracy.
Up and they're getting ready to get into action. As we see that they are making a show for themselves. All right, 3 million to 2.4 million. This one will go to South Korea. And now it's still South Korea. Oh no, wait, it's back and forth.
It's going back and forth constantly.
What is going on?
This is going to be so close yet again.
Oh my god, please don't do this to my heart. No. Nobody, please. Jump, spin to win, boys. Oh my god, South Korea.
South Korea takes that.
South Korea on lifeline. 27,000. So incredibly clutch. Sickle, they're dropping in when this map is ending.
Yeah, Fabricio needs to drop now. Gomo as well, dropping that full combo though. This is pretty much said and done. It will be going to Brazil unless we see a random fail at the end. But Fabricio has actually, I think Fabricio has failed.
What happened? Mel's easy, screaming WTF, what the hell is going on? Fabricio failed! This is going to be a tiebreaker, guys! Tiebreaker! Oh
Fabricio
my god!
with the fail right at the end there.
Recovering combo, they're eyeing for a miss from the string. I mean, can they possibly bring it back? Maybe not, I don't know really.
I think it's too big of a difference at this point, and there isn't any fail potential towards the end of this map. Despite this match being insanely close overall.
They took home the win in the end, but a team thought to be one of the tournament's frontrunners was nearly eliminated very early on. Germany would then win both of their matches, barely beating out Russia and having a pretty easy 7-1 win on Canada. And then there were the big matches, starting with Poland versus the UK. It seemed like it would probably be pretty close, and it was hard to find any sort of consensus on who was predicted to win. Since the UK had had a very strong performance the previous year, but Poland had always had an insane team on paper, and had been playing much better as of recent. In the end, both teams had ended up playing very well, but Poland would just edge it out with a 7-5 score. This meant that after years of having what should have been one of the strongest teams in the tournament, they were finally starting to perform like it. And this victory really cemented that they were going to be one of the frontrunners for this tournament. And then for the last match, which is the US versus Taiwan, it was a time for both teams to prove themselves, since the US hadn't had any very difficult matchups, and Taiwan had upset some of the best teams in the tournament. But after a 7-2 victory, the US would basically just reaffirm how dominant of a team they were, especially since Taiwan had already beaten South Korea. The US winning showed that they still were easily the best team in the entire tournament, and so going into the winners finals against Poland, they were clearly favored by a large margin to win. Since although Poland had been doing well, they had still not faced any teams with anywhere near the US's star power. And so, the finals began. I'll be honest, this entire time I've been sort of downplaying Poland, because although they had a very weak performance in the years prior, their team was incredible on paper. They had Rafis, the number 2 player in the world, and Wobbleful, who had previously been number 1, and who was known for being an incredible tournament player. And those weren't their only stupidly good players, because everyone on their team was exceptional at least one thing, with Piggy having great aim, Vilchq being very consistent, having incredibly good accuracy, and Mr. Boom being quite good at aim in general, and one of the best at weird aim. And that's just to name a few. And going into their match against the US, there were a few things they had going for them. Their team was finally performing, and as the map pool got more difficult, players like Rafis would only become more dominant. But even with all this, the chances of beating the US, one of the greatest tournament teams ever, seemed exceptionally slim. The US convincingly won the first 5 points of the game, making it clear that they had not only come to win, but they'd come to crush any hope that Poland might still have that they could win the tournament. And for almost the entirety of the 6th point, it seemed like the US was just going to continue this. Until this happened. The US had lost their first point, but it was by what was essentially a fluke, and so it didn't seem to prove much, and especially after winning the next point, Poland was 1 point away from losing, and it only won a single point on them, and that was because of somebody failing. Pretty much, any hope of the tournament being interesting had been crushed with this dominant of a showing from the US. And so now all they needed to do was win 1 point. But, as the commentators would say after they won their second point,
not today. They aren't going down yet.
and they seemed to hold on to this notion, winning 2 more points.
The win is going to Poland, though.
Before, it seemed like they finally would meet their end. Since on Night of Nights, at the very end of the map, they were down by almost 300,000 points, and it seemed basically irrecoverable, until the US did this. Poland was back in the game. They'd been given one more opportunity, and this time, they seized it, winning 1 more point and tying the game. Now it was on to the final, the tiebreaker on Tengaku.
Tire map near 8-star mechanics here. The combos are sporadic. Mr. Boom has a decent one. Hypno and Monko also have decent combos.
Raphis and Boom. Mr. Boom holding on to that jump. And Monko. Oh, this is so close.
We're coming back to the start of the match. Mr. Boom versus Monko.
Boom misses Monko. Still with the 500 combo. Oh, that really hurts.
This point is just so hard to hold any sort of major combo. We're approaching the final streams now.
Yeah, it's less than 100k difference here.
They can't make this back. This is Poland's to lose if they survive.
No one should fail this part. And holy hype, Poland at the end here. Coming away with the reverse sweep. Holy GG.
Can you believe this? Against the defending champions, the United States have, as far as I know, in the last 2 tournaments, never went down to the losers bracket outside of the final.
The US had lost, and they didn't even play badly. Poland was completely insane, and they just sent the US to losers, with a comeback that showed complete dominance over a team that was considered to be one of the greatest collections of players ever. The tables had turned, and now the tournament was starting to look a whole lot more interesting. The US had lost their spots as an easy bet for winning the tournament, and Poland had started to impede on that territory. And so it was really up in the air. Most people still expected the US to win if they faced Poland again. But after that match, it was pretty much impossible to be sure. This was the craziest match that would happen in the finals, but Taiwan and South Korea would give them a run for their money. Taiwan had finally beaten Korea after years of losing to them, but now Korea was about to have a chance to take back their spot on top. It was going to be a crazy match. One team was something to prove, and one was something to defend, and they both played like it. Firebat was apparently asleep when it started and only woke up halfway through. Despite this, they still won the first 4 points and only lost 1, meaning that Taiwan was on the ropes. And as the 6th match started, it was seeming like South Korea was just going to extend their lead, until Prey disconnected. South Korea was still almost able to win the match, and they certainly would have if not for Prey disconnecting. But they still had a big lead, and so it seemed like there wouldn't be much of a chance for Taiwan. But Taiwan seemed to capture the momentum from this first win and take it, winning 2 more maps and making the score 4-4. The 2 teams would then trade points back and forth until the score got to 6-6, and a tiebreaker on Tengaku.
I think everyone's going to be able to pass this. And they do.
So far,
My God.
South Korea showing an insane performance on that. Young coming in with a 400,000 score.
Yeah,
South Korea finally won, having all A ranks on the map, while the other team couldn't get 1. But although this was great for them, they still had 1 opponent left before they could face the US and losers. The UK, who would end up crushing South Korea and ending their run in the World Cup. This wasn't expected to be as cut and dry as it was, and it further showed just how good Poland was, since they had beaten the UK by a fair bit. And then the final match before the grand finals, the US versus the UK, which wasn't seeming as obvious anymore, since Poland had beaten the US by the same amount they did the UK, making it seem like maybe the US wasn't quite as strong as they seemed to be. But the US would still end up beating the UK 7-4, which was more than Poland, making it clear that the US was still a powerhouse, and that going into the grand finals, they weren't going to make the same mistakes they had last time. And so, the showdown between 2 of the greatest tournament teams ever commenced. First, with how the grand finals work. Basically, the team in winners gets a bracket reset if they lose, effectively giving them 2 chances, and so the team in losers has to win 2 in a row to actually win the tournament. And so, in this case, the US was fighting an uphill battle. But they were still predicted to win the tournament, since although Poland had a great team on paper, and now they were finally playing like it, the US had an even better team on paper, and they had proved in previous years that they could certainly perform, even with the stress that comes with playing in the biggest tournament in the entire world. And especially after beating the UK by more than Poland had, it seemed like they'd finally gotten back their stride. And so going into the match, nothing was certain, except for how insane it was going to be. And that, it certainly was. The first match of the set was a pretty cut and dry one, with the US winning 7-3. And although it wasn't all too interesting to watch, it did prove something. The US hadn't come to play. There may have been a certain amount of underestimation and underpreparation that came with thinking that they were facing a team who wasn't all that great. But they still were one of the greatest tournament teams ever, and it seemed like this time they really had gone all out. And with Poland losing the first round so convincingly, it seemed like they really weren't going to have much of a chance. The US had underperformed the first time, but now they were going to set the record straight, and all they needed to do was just win one more time. And so, the second set began. The US won the first point, but not in a way they probably would have liked, with the entire team playing a fair bit worse than Poland, except for Apraxia, who had by far the best score of anyone in the match. But it seemed that luckily for them, the second match started a lot better, with the 4-way FC until over halfway through the map, which made sense since it was their pick. And if they were to win this map, they would have a critical advantage in winning the match, in that if each team won their pick, the US would end up coming out on top. And it seemed they'd already gotten through the hard part when they took Poland's pick, and now they were about to take their own. That is, until almost their entire team lost combo, and Poland remained with 2 on their side, meaning that all they had to do was keep their combos, and they would win the map and tie it up. And they were doing it. Up until the last 10 seconds of the match, Poland was very clearly winning the map. Until this happened.
Piggy fails!
Piggy had clearly been struggling throughout the entire map, but this was still pretty unlucky. This gave the US the critical advantage that they needed. But they would choke this and lose 2 points, including Poland's and their own pick, which tied it up, meaning that both teams had won either the same amount or more of their opponent's picks than their own, which pretty much just proved how similar these teams were. Both of them were great at basically everything, and so either one's pick could go to the other at any time, which made things a bit more interesting. And this became even more clear after the US won Poland's and their picks once again to make the score 4-2. And at this point, the match was basically an exact copy of what had happened in the first round. Now all the US had to do was win 3 maps. 3 maps, and it was over. And with Toy nearly beating all of Poland by himself on their pick, the US only had 2 left to go. But Poland seemed determined not to let this happen. And so, they began crawling back the US's lead. They won their third point through Rafis, who basically destroyed both teams all by himself. Poland then won their pick fairly convincingly, leading the entire map. And then, just like that, the US had lost the lead. And after Apraxia DC'd in the middle of a map, Poland was only 1 point away from winning the entire tournament, from beating the reigning champions and sending a seemingly undefeatable team home in the biggest tournament ever. And so, they did.
My goodness, the performance from Wolf here. He is showing up right here on this pick right now. Axarius is still holding onto a really nice combo. Combo resets all across the board though. Axarius drops, Rafis drops, Wolf is still holding on!
It's just Wolf! The score is well in advantage. There's not much fail potential on this map. It's theirs to lose. And Wolf looking to do it in style.
My goodness, Wolf. Wobbuff Wolf is just stepping up here, coming in with a full combo from Ryoshi, no Umi, no Linworm.
That's it. That is it.
That is it. Poland.
Poland had done it. They had toppled the giant, and not only lived up to, but surpassed any expectations that there were for them. And all on the back of Wobbuff Wolf, who had basically completed the game at this point, reaching number 1, setting the PP record, and now winning an OWC. Poland also won the mock tengaku game, making it pretty clear that they really were the better team. And when they ended it all, This was their reaction.
Koniec drugiego miejsca! W końcu jest... O, w końcu mamy pierwsze miejsce! I played this game 8 years, Alice. And I finally got something out of it. Ej, no to ten, Itkiemu pewnie się pęd zepsuł. O kurczak.